Welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy channel, and welcome to another installment in the Georgian wine series. Yes, the wonderful country of Georgia that makes some of the most interesting wines in the world. Very captivating. So, we are looking at a multi part series on this wonderful country, a total of 17 videos. And welcome to the middle ground. We are looking at part 10, and we're focusing on the ever wonderful amber winemaking part. So I'm going to go through a little bit of information here about the history of the qvevri. We'll then go through the production of it, the winemaking process, and then finally the style that one expects from amber winemaking. If you have any comments or questions, please get in touch and comment in the section below this video. Have you been to Georgia? Do you like the amber wines? Are you a fan of the qvevri style? Please do get in touch. Make sure you click like and subscribe as well. Let's rock and roll. Now, it must be noted immediately that an orange or an amber wine isn't necessarily a wine that is 100% made from qvevri. You can make them, of course, in a multitude of vessels. But because we're focusing on Georgia, we will focus on the qvevri in this section. So just a little bit of history for you to begin with. Now, in the 8th century BC, written sources, which were majorly in Greek, mentioned those qvevri wine styles, or qvevris, the actual clay pots, from Western and Eastern Georgia. So we have a link immediately to this. Now, this is important because the Greek cities, the ancient Greek cities, and the likes of the states like the Minoans, who were in Crete, of course, have also their own documentation of vessels like this. You've only got to go to Heraklion in Crete, to the wonderful archaeological museum, and you'll see lots of examples of these. Pithos, they're called in Crete and Greece, and qvevri, of course, from Georgia. So it's kind of mentioning around that time, from Minoan to ancient Greek time. Also, Homer's Iliad mentions wines from the Colchis area, which is the land of the Golden Fleece, and that's the modern-day Guria or Samagrelo area on the Black Sea coast. In the 7th century BC, the modern qvevri form was developed, and then in the 6th century BC, we have qvevri being found in both eastern and western Georgia, and the shapes or forms of them were differing between the two. Then we come down here to the 4th century BC onwards, and the bottom part of the qvevri from this time becomes more pointed, and that's to bear the weight of the earth around them. They also, around the same time, become a larger vessel. Moving into much more modern times, the Soviet era and the domination of the Soviets meant that the qvevri actually fell out of favor. It was actually discouraged by the Soviets. And that's really because they were focusing majorly on more controllable, quicker, and higher volume stainless steel tanks. Now, partly because of this, the use of qvevri is seen as a symbol of individualism and rebellion. And it mightily is important. In fact, during this time, the Soviet occupation, we find that, in fact, a lot of the traditional qvevri makers, those who would fire up the kilns and make these wonderful clay pots, they disappeared. There was many of them that, of course, had to go and find work elsewhere. And only really a handful of producers survived I suppose let's call it the dark ages for the qvevri producers. Thankfully, today, this old traditional process of making qvevri has actually rebounded and is going through somewhat of a small but confident revolution. In 2013, UNESCO recognized qvevri on their list of intangible cultural heritage, and by 2021, wine made in qvevri made up around 10% of the total wine production of Georgia. So 1 out of 10 bottles. A little bit about the production of this wonderful vessel. You'll see a picture there of qvevri in a kiln, and that's for firing it up. Now, qvevri translates into English, meaning that that which is buried. So, of course, these are clay pots which, in terms of their use, is going to be buried in the ground traditionally. qvevri shapes differ slightly depending on the region that they are made. And in fact, they're handmade. So therefore, every one is different. So there's no exact same size of each of these qvevris. Now, local clay will be used. qvevri made by coiling sausage-shaped coils of clay before firing in a very hot kiln for a few days, well over 1000 degrees C, typically 1100, 1200, 1300. The internal surface inside the qvevri is covered with beeswax, and this smooths the interior, allowing for better circulation during fermentation, but also is more hygienic in terms of the wine that goes in. Now, the wax minimizes porosity and prevents leaks, and it's also seen, as I mentioned, to be more hygienic and also for easier cleaning. Now, the outer surface that we see with our eyes may be covered with a lime-based mortar before they are buried in the ground or in the ground of a marani, which is the wine cellar. And that's to, of course, give it a strengthening position, because you've got to remember the earth moves with all of its activity. So this could be problematic, of course, for the clay pots that are buried. There is a traditional cellar there for you, a marani, as you'll see identified on the bottom left. Now, depending on the region where a qvevri is buried, of course, will completely vary. So it may be in the cellar, it may be outside, it can be a bit of both, I suppose, as well. Now, remembering that qvevris are all different, no two are the same, they can range from 100 litres up to something like 3 or 4,000 litres. It is believed that something like 1,000 to 1,200 litres is the best for fermentation in terms of reaching and maintaining the best temperature for fermentation. Most winemakers who adopt the process of qvevri will have varying different sizes. Now, remember, hygiene is important, but it is difficult given the qvevri are buried in the ground, and also because of the porous nature of clay. So the qvevri is cleaned by removing all solids, and the cleaner will usually climb into the qvevri. There is danger pay. There is a scrubbing brush, which is made out of cherry bark, and that is called a sarchkvi. Now, I will scribble that up here for you just so you can see how it is spelt in comparison to the pronunciation of my Georgian, which of course is not the greatest. I'll put it down the bottom right there. Sarchkvi, just right in the bottom right. Winemaking process then next. So the traditional Georgian winemaking is that we ferment and we will age in the qvevri. So it's a dual process. We are looking at, of course, amber wine. And amber wine is where skin contact wine is made from white grapes, fermented and aged in qvevri. Grapes are typically sorted, and then as whole bunches or full bunches, they're traditionally placed in these sashnakelis, which I've written already up here, which are these kind of stone or wooden troughs, and then are subject to foot treading. Foot treading prevents damage to the pips, and it gives I suppose, a more gentle crushing of the grapes. Modern winemakers are experimenting with basket presses, of course. So this process might not be as adoptable for a modern winery. So, of course, there is modern innovation, which is slightly changing this up today. Now, after this crushing process, the juice is poured into the qvevri around 75 to 85% full. The chacha, which you've got on the right-hand side there, which is the grape mark, this comprises of the skins, stalks, pips. It's also sometimes called the mother. This is added to the qvevri as well to, of course, ferment. The amount of chacha added will depend on the region and the winemaking choices. So it doesn't always mean that all of the skins will be added, of course. And then we go into fermentation. Fermentation is usually all very natural with ambient yeasts. The peak fermentation tends to be about 28 degrees Celsius, and it lasts for about 1 to 2 weeks. Malolactic fermentation may occur at the same time as alcoholic fermentation, but is generally discouraged for Cacetian amber wines and is generally inhibited by cooler temperatures and lower pH levels in places like Imereti, remembering that Malo needs more stable conditions. Now, during fermentation, the cap will be punched down very regularly, around 4 to 5 times a day, which is a significant amount of time. And that's to provide oxygen for the fermentation and to, of course, encourage extraction. Now, for those that are not wanting as much, of course, this can be minimalized, the process, but you'll see in action there, you'll see some punching down. Now, when fermentation is over, the seeds and skins and stalks will settle to the bottom of the qvevri, and the top of the qvevri at this time will be sealed, and that's to, of course, protect it and also mean that you won't get people falling in, which could be dangerous, but fruit flies, things like that. So it seals the vessel. Now, traditionally, they were not reopened again until spring. That's something like 5 to 6 months later. But of course, this will depend today on the style which is desired. The shape of the qvevri encourages circulation of the juice and grape mark. Now, think about how many modern wineries today are implementing the likes of concrete eggs. It's a very similar thought process behind it in terms of that circulation. Now, grape pips naturally fall to the very bottom, being the most dense, stems on top of that, and then skins on top of those, like I have identified in the picture you see just there. This keeps the wine in contact with the skins, but not the more bitter pips and the stalks. The wine is then racked off either into a different qvevri or a different vessel, depending on the winemaking choices. And there may be some skins still kept if you are wanting further intensity. There are usually no additions like sulfur dioxide because you have a lot of natural protection already from grape skins. I mentioned this a little bit already. The grape mark from the qvevri, so those leftover skins, could be distilled into a grape spirit and typically are, and this is called chacha. And you can find some of these being aged. Typically, they are not, and these are often around 60% alcohol by volume. Very proud, the Georgians, of their chacha. If you are given one, please do enjoy it. And it's quite an honor, in fact, to have some chacha. Sort of methodology behind winemaking from two of the major areas here you'll see. So on the left, we have more of the Western style, which is the Western style, which is the Imeretian. And then on the right, the Kakhetian style. So let's start with the right hand side there. So this is the Kakhetian style from Eastern Georgia. Traditionally include 100% stalks and skins. Elsewhere in Georgia, typically the stalks aren't always ripe enough to be included. Kankati wines, therefore, with this heavy inclusion of all of those solids, mean that we have higher tannins, firmer texture, more color, and you get that intensity, that concentration. Western Georgia, on the left hand side there, Imeretian style. They only use some of the skins rather than all, and the wine is often racked off the cha sooner, after 1 or 2 months. This gives a lighter, both in color and in intensity. The Imereti qvevri are also known locally as churi, Churi. In other places, such as Racha and the Black Sea coast, the crushed grapes may be left in the wine press for around 4 to 5 days before pouring into the Cavevri and then continue fermenting without the skins. So, quite a few differences can be done. And of course, this isn't exclusive. There are, of course, crossovers. Now, remember the winemaking choices, the different presses versus the sashnakeli, the troughs that we can find the pressing, the amount of stalks included, and some of them may be sun ripened before being added, a way of pre-lignifying them, so actually turning them into more kind of wooden stalks rather than green stems. The length of skin contact time and the length of time in a sealed qvevri, plus the use of oak barrels or inert vessels for fermentation, for example, can all be winemaking options which can change amber winemaking techniques. So I mentioned this at the start. Not everything is for amber wine is exclusively in qvevri. You will find them, of course, in oak, in stainless steel. So do look out for those expressions as well. It's worth mentioning that qvevri are actually reductive rather than oxidative, and qvevri wine shouldn't have any oxidative notes. Studies are still ongoing to how inert they are as a vessel, but studies show that any flavors do not come from the qvevri themselves, only from the skin contact. Though some people will mention that they believe they find that kind of clay-based character in their wines. So, what does one expect then from the amber style? So, traditional Georgian winemaking in qvevri tends to have characters like dried apricots and other dried fruits, nuts, and things like citrus peels, like orange peel. But also look out for things like tea leaves and quite exotic spices. You might find kind of tamarind, turmeric. You might find paprika, nutmeg, characteristics which can be littered within these beautiful wines. Generally, the wines are dry, and of course, due to their skin contact, can be very dry, medium to high acidity, very high tannin, full bodied with medium to high alcohols. The tannin will add texture, savoriness, and concentration. We can also find high levels of volatile acidity, and this is something which can really lift the wine out of the glass. But for some people, they can find it a little bit too much, becoming a little bit overtly balsamic. Traditionally, they are not chilled. These are wines which are served as reds. And you'll find probably serving them, to be honest, room temperature is perfectly fine. The lighter ones, though, the more delicate ones, probably could have a little bit of a chill. These are the quintessential gastronomical wines. They're brilliant with food, full fat cheeses and meat stews, walnut based dishes. Remember, walnut, very important in Georgian cuisine, and spicy food. They are phenomenally versatile to go with many types of dishes, not only just Georgian cuisine, but world cuisine. Okay, well, that brings me to a conclusion of the video on amber winemaking. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Please do join me for red winemaking next. If you do have any comments or questions, of course, please do get in touch. You can do so by commenting on the video below. And also, if you do find yourself in the UK, come and say hello at one of my establishments for a class, glass, or bottle. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now. Goodbye.